Thank you for taking the time to be here to listen to my proposal. And I know a lot has changed since we last spoke, and it changed quickly. So what I'd like to cover is some of the changes that I made in relationship to the suggestions that were given to me, and along with some of the changes that we had to make based on the current circumstances. So the first thing I want to go over is to cover some of the new items, specifically items that were added to my Chapter 2 Lit review in order to inform me on how to make a stronger randomized control trial. And then also part of that is going to be the inclusion of an overview of digital interventions. Then we'll cover my new specific aims and hypotheses, my methods, and then strengths and limitations. When I was covering the literature review, there were four things that I wanted to look at particularly. The first was an examination of the constructs related to behavior that should therefore be targeted. And this was what I had covered initially. So what we see as constructs that are related to resistance training behavior, we have affective attitude, self-efficacy, self-regulation, and then intention. So I had covered that previously. But next it was an examination of which behavior change techniques are useful for enhancing these constructs, and then under which conditions a specific behavior change technique was actually effective. So how is that technique carried out? Can it be replicated? And then to what extent was the technique carried out? So next would be which constructs, when enhanced, will also have an impact on behavior. So I'm curious to know what should we be targeting that's going to have the biggest impact on behavior. So if we're talking about an examination of which behavior change techniques are useful for enhancing constructs, when we looked at the literature, we saw that self-efficacy and behavioral expectations, self-regulation, and outcome expectations were the constructs that were targeted in experimental studies. And with the exception of Milne and Bray, there was no evidence that an intervention had positive impacts on the construct of self-efficacy. But interventions did have positive impacts on behavioral expectations, self-regulations, and also outcome expectations. And a common approach, a common technique for enhancing self-regulation was barrier identification, and then helping participants make plans to overcome those barriers. So next would be under which conditions was a specific behavior change technique effective. And for this, I used the tidier checklist. And this builds off of the consort statement. So it's the template for intervention, description, and replication. And it's used to improve the completeness of reporting in order to improve replication of studies. And the 9 subtopics that I focused on were: 1, brief name, why, what materials, what procedures, who provided it, how was it provided, where was it provided, when and how much was provided, and whether or not the intervention was tailored. And now when I looked through all of the research, and we only had 6 experimental studies, I found that item 8, when and how much, was an item that was frequently missing details or was insufficient. For example, how much might be a 10-minute counseling session for a 12-week long study, which would be a very minimal intervention. Now, through the lens of that tidier framework, the most rigorous study was conducted by Winnett et al., and the secondary analysis was completed on that study by Williams et al. So this study provides details for each of the categories in the checklist. Therefore, that study served as a basis for replication. Under several caveats, which included time, our study would not be as long, and then also mechanisms of delivery. So ours would be entirely digital compared to what they had, which was in person and also digital. So next would be which constructs, when enhanced, will have an impact on behavior. And this Winnett study is going to be useful as well, along with the Williams secondary analysis. So 2 studies conducted a mediation analysis, and Williams and colleagues observed that changes in behavioral expectation and self-regulation were significant mediators of resistance training behavior. And Lubin's also found that self-regulation was a significant mediator of resistance training behavior. And these 2 studies together suggest that self-regulation and behavioral expectations are important targets for resistance training interventions. And then to add on to that in terms of digital interventions, so several of the current resistance training studies utilize methods other than face-to-face to deliver their intervention. So these methods did include telephone calls and also through Skype. So there have been digital components to resistance training studies. There just hasn't been a purely digital resistance training study. And in terms of digital interventions for physical activity, meta-analysis suggests that internet-delivered programs have a small but positive effect on physical activity, and Good and colleagues found strong evidence for telephone-delivered physical activity interventions. Now I want to move into my specific aims and hypotheses. So the first specific aim is to assess if a digital resistance training intervention plus behavioral coaching based on the health action process approach can increase resistance training behavior in novice participants over the same digital resistance training intervention plus a contact control coaching group, which focuses on nutrition. I hypothesize that the digital resistance training plus behavioral coaching group will engage in significantly more resistance training sessions than the contact control group. My specific aim 2 has several sub-aims. The overarching aim is to examine the mechanisms through which the intervention worked. So my first aim within that subcategory is to examine if the digital resistance training behavioral coaching intervention has more positive changes in intention, behavioral expectations, and coping planning than the digital RT plus contact control group. And I hypothesize that relative to participants in the digital RT plus contact control, participants in the digital RT plus behavioral coaching group would show more positive changes in the targeted putative mediators, including intention, behavioral expectations, and coping planning. The next aim is to examine if changes in intention, behavioral expectations, and coping planning predict changes in behavior. I hypothesize that changes in attention, behavioral expectations, and coping planning will be predictive of resistance training behavior at the follow-up time point. And the last sub-aim is to examine the mechanisms through which the behavioral coaching intervention exerted its effects. I hypothesize that the relative effects of the intervention on resistance training behavior would occur through coping planning and behavioral expectations. So we'll move into the methods. Here is an overview of the study design, and we made some changes compared to the original study that I discussed with a similar design. So we start out by training trainers, recruiting participants. Participants will go through 3 different phases in this study. The first one is a run-in period. It's a guided resistance training phase, which will last 1 week and 2 sessions. Once participants have completed 2 sessions, they will be randomized to either the behavioral coaching group or the contact control group. And that will lead us into phase 2. In phase 2, the intervention will occur for participants in that behavioral coaching group. They'll end up receiving behavioral coaching on 4 separate occasions. And participants in the contact control group will receive nutrition information sessions, and it's going to be matched. So for every 1 behavioral coaching session, the contact control group will also receive a nutrition session. Participants are going to get access to the same exact materials in phase 1. They'll get access to resistance training bands and dumbbells. They'll get access to a training application, and they'll receive Zoom coaching to cover the resistance training protocol. After randomization, participants will also get access to training videos so that they can train on their own. We'll start out with training the trainers. So prior to commencing the study, student volunteers with personal training experience will be recruited by the PI to be trained to serve as personal trainers for the study. And up to 3 student volunteers will be recruited for this study. And once recruited, students will spend 2 virtual sessions with the PI learning the routine, standardized coaching cues, and ways to correct common errors that may be observed in each exercise. Trainers will gain access to resistance training videos and digital training manuals that will be provided to the participants. So trainers will get everything the participants will get. On the 3rd training session, student assistants will complete a mock run of the training program to ensure competency with cueing and error correction. And additional training will occur until they are sufficiently proficient to complete the training protocol independent of the PI. Moving on to recruitment. Participants will be recruited on an ongoing basis via campus-wide emails. Participants responding to the emails will be given a Qualtrics eligibility survey, and the screening questions will address exclusion criteria. So exclusion criteria would be younger than 18 or older than 35, any contraindications as measured by the PARQ, and then averaging over one resistance training session per week, or at least one resistance training session per week. Next, moving on to the guided resistance training protocol. All digital resistance training will be conducted in the participant's home through Zoom. Participants will engage in 2 coach sessions separated by at least 48 hours. Sessions will focus on technique, and participants will also be familiarized with the resistance training application. Now, the resistance training application can be viewed on your phone or on a desktop, Surface, iPad, or laptop. And here's a brief example of what a participant might see, and this is a single exercise. So what a participant can do is they can go to the Add Results tab, and they can add in the weight that they did, and they can also add in the repetitions that they did, and we know which day they completed the program on as well. Each exercise will have an explanation that they can look at as well. So that would be an example of what they would be able to see on the participant end. These resistance training sessions will focus on mastery of each of these exercises. Now, there are 4 common exercises along with 5 different rotating exercises in each session. And again, these exercises were based on ACSM recommendations and are similar to what I had mentioned prior to our last talk. And I just showed you the resistance training application. So next would be randomization. Participants will be randomized through a random numbers generator into either the behavioral coaching group or the contact control group. And there's going to be some common components. For example, all participants will now be given access or be made aware of the resistance training in-home website. And this is what that website looks like. Now, this website was designed specifically for this study. Each tab represents one of the 4 routines that you just saw, so they can click on any routine that they want. So if they wanted to do routine 3, they can click on that, and what they can do is they can go through all of these circuits as they're ordered. So circuit 1 is going to include the warm-up, some standardized cues for each exercise written in, circuit 2, and then circuit 3. What they can also do is they can download a PDF of the program so that they know what they're going to be doing that day. So these PDFs, once they download them, they tell you which day that they're on. They give links to all of the videos that they're going to be doing. They give an overview of the circuit, a start of circuit 1 with a reminder of where the link is, which they can click. Then each one is going to have an image of the first part of the exercise and then the bottom part of the exercise with some standardized cueing. So each day has a PDF associated with it that looks just like this. And those are some of the common components. Next is going to be our actual intervention portion. So we have our digital resistance training and coaching and contact control coaching group, and we also have our behavioral coaching group. The primary difference between the digital RT and contact control group and the digital RT behavioral coaching group is that the coaching will be educational and about nutrition topics not related to resistance training behavior. The duration and frequency of the sessions will be matched between the 2 conditions. Meetings will occur within 1 week after randomization, and then subsequently on 3 other occasions separated out by 1 week. Now, the digital RT plus behavioral coaching experimental group will focus on behavior change. The digital RT and behavioral coaching group will undergo a HAPA-based intervention using interactive self-regulation procedures related to resistance training behaviors. And here's an example of the script that we will follow for these sessions. So what we'll do is we will have participants fill out a digital calendar with all of their commitments for the week. After that, we'll decide when they can fill in resistance training into their actual routine. They will also identify any barriers that they might foresee coming up, and we're going to ask them to write plans to overcome those barriers. Next, we're going to ask them when they would like a text message reminder of the time from which they would like to do resistance training. And here's a brief overview of what's going to happen for both groups for phase 2. So again, this just covers common components, timeframes for everything, access to the website, access to the training app, and that the primary difference is just that participants will either engage in those nutrition information sessions or the digital resistance training and behavioral coaching sessions. So moving on to our follow-up, after those 4 sessions, there will be a 4-week follow-up period. So after the completion of phase 2, participants will be instructed to do resistance training on their own by following the resistance training videos on the app or in the rtinhome.com website. And now what we will be measuring throughout this study is going to be affective attitude, self-efficacy, intentions, behavioral expectations, and coping planning. And there's going to be 5 separate measurement time points in the guided practice phase. So in phase 1, we'll measure psychological constructs at the end of the first session and also at the end of the second session. We're also going to measure those psychological constructs after the first coaching session. So after the first session in phase 2. We'll also measure behavior and the psychological constructs when phase 2 ends, and we'll also measure those one more time when the third phase of this study comes to a conclusion. Moving on to the analysis plan. To recap, the first aim of this study is to assess if a digital resistance training intervention plus behavioral coaching based on the health action process approach can increase resistance training behavior in novice participants over the same digital resistance training intervention plus contact control coaching. So we hypothesized that the digital resistance training plus behavioral coaching intervention will produce significantly greater adherence to resistance training. An independent samples t-test will be run to determine differences in mean scores between the digital RT behavioral coaching group and the digital RT plus contact control group at the conclusion of the study on resistance training behavior. Our part 2, our second aim, has 3 categories. So for the first one, it's to examine if the digital resistance training plus behavioral coaching has more positive changes in intention, behavioral expectations, and coping planning than the digital RT plus contact control group. And we hypothesized that relative to participants in the digital RT contact control condition, participants in the digital RT plus behavioral coaching condition would show more positive changes in the targeted putative mediators, which include intention, behavioral expectations, and coping planning. And we'll test the effects of treatment on changes in intention, behavioral expectations, and coping planning. Aim 2B is to examine if changes in intention, behavioral expectations, and coping planning predict changes in behavior. We hypothesize that changes in intention, behavioral expectations, and coping planning will predict resistance training behavior at the follow-up time point. We'll test the effects of changes in intention, behavioral expectations, and coping planning on behavior. Last, Aim 2C is to examine the mechanisms through which the behavioral coaching intervention exerted its effect. We hypothesize that the relative effects of the intervention on RT behavior would occur through coping planning and behavioral expectation. In the analysis, each mediator will be tested independently and will be coded with a change score. The treatment effects will be estimated using a series of regression models to examine the potential mediating effects of behavioral expectations and coping planning. Some strengths and limitations of this study. This will be only the second resistance training study, which gives names to the behavior change techniques used along with the dose of the behavior change technique. For example, Lubins and Williams both named the behavior change techniques that were used, but only Williams, along with the original study by Winnett, gave the reader the actual dose of the behavior change technique. So the Lubin study, we don't know how often these behavior change techniques were actually applied. This study also has strength that it's following the tidier checklist. This will help to improve replicability of the study. Moving along with that, in terms of replicability, is open access to all the materials through the website. Also, to reduce bias, the study was informed by the Cochrane collaboration tool for assessing bias. Some limitations that we have to do with the novelty of a behavior change, digitally based resistance training intervention. This would be the first intervention that is solely digitally based. Now, with a less controlled environment like this, there is a potential threat to internal validity. For example, although assessed via self-report tracking in the training app, there'll be no objective measure of whether participants engage in resistance training or other forms of resistance training in this study. And at this time, I will open it up to any questions that you may have.